Hello, in this video, I want to start a brand new series for the worker strike resolution for LD, talking a little bit about Deleuze and Guattari. I think that Deleuze and Guattari will definitely be something that shows up on the worker strike resolution, whether it's just straight up arguments from Deleuze, not primary source probably, but obviously people that are just reading a more positive interpretation of Deleuze, but also I think dark Deleuze might show up, and so obviously it's important to just have a good understanding of what Deleuze and Guattari are really talking about in their writings, and an understanding of what it could really look like on the resolution. And so I definitely want to talk a little bit about what I think the arguments that are mainly important from them are, and what I think they're really going to pertain to in terms of how they make the type of research that'll be done in their area for this resolution. I definitely think that if this is your first time hearing about Deleuze and Guattari, I'm going to try to go over some of the ideas that they have that are really central to why I think the arguments that are going to be made this year are, and then I'll try to apply them a little bit to what I think the main ways they can be used on the affirmative and the negative are, and their possible uses on this resolution. And so hopefully that'll get you a better idea, because I definitely did a set of Deleuze and Guattari videos a while ago, I think for the water protections resolution for policy, but I'm not really sure if those are up yet or not, and so I definitely want to start a little bit fresh in terms of just talking a little bit more about who Deleuze and Guattari are and what some of their most important arguments are. So Gilles Deleuze and Felice Guattari. Deleuze was a philosopher and Guattari was a psychoanalyst. They are both doing an analysis of desire as a positive process that produces reality. Desire is a machine, and the object of desire is a machine connected to it. They see the Oedipus complex, or the normative, I guess not normative, but the Freudian interpretation of psychoanalysis that revolves around basically the idea of desire as being geared towards the replication of the father, or the killing of the father, and the fornication of the mother, or whatever. And their argument is that the Oedipal model for desire is repressive and doesn't allow us to think about the productive ways in which desire can be used as a process to produce the way in which we live in the world. Deleuze and Guattari make a lot of arguments that I think are especially pertinent to this topic in the context of deterritorialization, assemblage theory, and war machines, which I think are three concepts that are incredibly important for this particular resolution. Deterritorialization is a move towards multiplicity, and is the process of becoming that erases the barriers between identities produced by capitalism and produces nomadism, and is done via nomadism. So I think that a lot of the arguments that Deleuze and Guattari are really making in relationship between some of this stuff that I've explained about desire above and identity is that their acknowledgement of the forces of capitalism and the way in which it produces differences from identity, whether that be race, class, sex, etc., and the way in which that is then used as a source of the policing and active repression of desire as productive and positive force, ultimately leads to the ability for the state, institutions of power, etc., to be able to monopolize space and time, and the ability to basically monopolize our abilities to articulate ourselves as subjects and as agents. And this coercive, post-structural engagement with how they're thinking about power, I think is definitely really important for how we'll consider this when it's applied to the resolution. The assemblage theory or assemblages in themselves are compositions of systems that are marked by territorialization and deterritorialization. And so lines of flight, or the way in which people attempt to escape the various types of ways in which identity or various types of grids of identity are used to try to capture subjecthood and agency, ultimately represent the impossibility of being able to flatten how people live in multiplicity, i.e., although there is an identity grid system, or as Deleuze and Guattari acknowledging, an ability to be able to grid out how various types of identities orient themselves in the world, and the ability to police and make them visible and recognizable, there's also an impossibility to the ability to flatten how people live through multiple identities, multiple experiences that converge at various types of identities, etc. And all of these kinds of acknowledgments basically are meant to acknowledge that the identity grid, there's always something that it cannot capture, right? There's always this force of excess, this kind of like multiplicity that exists outside of the confines of what's able to kind of be territorialized or being able to take over by these institutions and by the state. And so when you're kind of considering what the war machine is, the war machine is a composition of like nomads and relationship to assemblages that is about the production of a resistance towards the state. The war machine, as Deleuze and Guattari are writing it, is not the property of the state and is formed in opposition to it, but it is vulnerable to capture even though it is formed through nomads and nomadism. I think that this is like really where the topic begins to kind of like introduce itself into like what you'll be studying. And I think on the affirmative and the negative, a lot of the debates that Deleuze and Guattari will be having are what is the relationship between the worker strike? Is it a war machine? And how is the state's attempt to recognize it a part of the ability to quell the war machine's ability to exist? And how does it basically promote basically an inability to think about like how we are able to think of resistance as independent and in resistance to the state? And how does the state's move of recognition create a paradigm in which war machines can kind of be captured by various types of state apparatuses through these attempts to basically make them down into like whether or not they're able to like exist as workers? And I think that this allows a lot of arguments to be made about how the worker strike solidifies itself as its kind of like own identity within the identity grid, and the way in which that kind of invests in the state kind of territorialization of space and time. And I feel like whether you're making arguments from the vein of dark Deleuze, which I definitely want to make another series on, or if you're kind of going down, we'll be talking about mostly in this series with a more like positivist interpretation of Deleuze and the way that he's thinking about like war machines and other stuff. There are a lot of core arguments to be made about why the worker strike relationship to the state is especially dangerous, and why the kind of like legal establishment of the workers strike basically invests in the kind of like systems of repression that Deleuze and Guattari are really kind of like citing and critiquing, which I think are definitely super important to the worker strike movement. I definitely think makes some really core good arguments about why the kind of like resolution is limited in its ability to actually contribute to something that is like what the revolution potential of the worker strike is. But I think that there's also the ability to kind of discuss how the kind of like on the negative side, the ability to once again kind of like recognize that worker strike movement makes it impossible for us to think about it as something antagonistic, as something that serves to actually make difference, because of the ways in which it basically perpetuates the ability of the state to monopolize its control over like resistance, its control over what movements are made legible or recognizable in the first place, which I think is like the core of what a lot of the critical arguments are really supposed to be doing on this resolution. So hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll come and tune in for more. And yeah, thanks as always, for sure.